Show goes on. Yes. So, all right. So, anyway, I'm here to talk about a few things. We're going to just get started. Please do, like the stream, subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and of course, support the show. I'm 6 subscribers away from 400 on Patreon, which is my monthly goal this month, just to keep the ball rolling towards sustainability in this journalism work. So please do subscribe if you are able, but make sure you like the stream. If you're on any other platform, because I do stream on Twitter and Facebook, please go to the YouTube channel, like the stream, help boost it in the algorithm. So I'm going to move right into this story. Mr. Enes Kanter, we've spoken about him before. Enes Kanter Freedom, the discredited former NBA player now because he has been cut. And I give a huge applause to all of the teams that finally did what was necessary, not for political reasons, but purely because he has nothing left in the tank and he really doesn't have any value to any team. I'm a big Celtics fan, so he was really a big nothing burger in that area for me. But he's been cut, and now his decision to speak at the Conservative Political Action Committee, the huge GOP super PAC that holds regular conferences to spout off at the mouth their reactionary imperialist agenda. They invited him to speak, and he had accepted for later this month. But now he is no longer going to speak because, and I'm going to share this, he needs to focus on NBA things. He needs to figure out his NBA career. So here we go. Mr. Enes Kanter is no longer going to be speaking at this conference. Let me just scroll up to the right place. So Enes Kanter Freedom pulls out of CPAC. I need to figure out this NBA stuff first. Yeah, he really does. He's been wasting a lot of our energy, honestly. I mean, it's just pure political opportunism for him. Enes Kanter Freedom, we're talking about the Beijing 2022 Olympics. He really kicked off the intense anti-China propaganda campaign several months ago through these tweets about China's so-called human rights violations, which have all been debunked already. But Enes Kanter then decided to make this whole shoe line. He decided to really jump on this bandwagon, and I think with political help, right? He had already been hobnobbing with Marco Rubio, with John Bolton, with the GOP. He basically was regurgitating Mike Pompeo's talking points at the close. Well, Trump was already done, but he was basically repeating the Trump administration, Mike Pompeo's talking points on China, which Biden has very willfully adopted. But nonetheless, this is where Enes Kanter Freedom is at. He has spent the last several months promoting this propaganda about China leading up into the Olympics, has jumped on the human rights atrocity propaganda campaign. He has been rubbing shoulders with all of the National Endowment for Democracy's sponsored organizations, which are using millions of US tax dollars to promote anti-China rhetoric and to smear China as some sort of human rights catastrophe. So here he is. He changed his name to Freedom. And so this is just going over what he's done. He's called out LeBron James for supposedly towing China's line. And here's just some of the disgusting things that Mediaite is covering. But last week, the Swiss-born Turkish American was confirmed as a speaker for this year's CPAC. So here you go. He was going to go to Florida, rub shoulders with the far right in the United States. And now the Rockets, after the trade deadline, they picked him up and they cut him. So he is no longer in the NBA. And given how he was playing on the Celtics, the few minutes he was receiving, I don't think he's really going to be picked up and play any real significant minutes for the rest of the year. So Heavy reported some in the league shared doubts after Freedom was waived that he would be able to land another contract in the NBA. Freedom now seems to be highlighting the uncertainty over whether he will get another NBA job by the fact that he has been outspoken on a number of issues. He has been retweeting comments from conservative legislators who argue he is being punished for his stances against the government in China, which is a ridiculous assertion for so many reasons. But I don't know if anyone else signs him, maybe not. I think maybe from a basketball standpoint, it's really questionable. I'm not sure if any of the staff of the other stuff will even come into play. I don't think he won't get a job because of anything he said or done. I think he just doesn't guard, and the game is changing. He plays a lot older than he really is. So I think that's more accurate. That's actually incredibly accurate about Mr. Enes Kanter. Uh, so so John Smith, okay, I see you out here. So yeah, Enes Kanter, he is trying to, and he hasn't expressed this, but his friends on the far right have expressed this, that he's a victim of persecution, speaking out against China. But that's ridiculous given what this GM is saying, which is wholly accurate. And his Cantor has never been able to play defense, and this is just some basketball talk. Never has been able to play defense, but he had some offensive talent. He could offensive rebound with the best of them, and that made him useful. Well, when that started to change, when those skills started to diminish his effectiveness on the offensive end, well, his defense just became even more of a liability. He really doesn't move his feet on defense. He gets killed. And after the Celtics let him go, they've been on fire. This has been a pattern throughout Enes Kanter's career where it seems like teams are better off without him. So that's essentially who Enes Kanter is. He's a poor basketball player, and he was also a poor pawn in this broader imperialist front against China. He was not effective, right? I think that the only reason why he was even taken seriously was because the corporate media, especially Fox News, but really across the gambit, gave him attention. The Boston Celtics had this, like, at the TD Garden, they had this, like, thank you, almost kind of, he got a standing ovation for his stand. I mean, that's how you know Boston is just that reactionary. Where I'm from is when they'll praise someone as sorry as Enes Kanter. But nonetheless, this is where he's at. And, honestly, he had it coming. I mean, think about this, guys. Let's take the political issue as true, right? That he is being persecuted because he is slamming China, which I don't think has any truth to it. But let's say it is true. Think about what it means to denigrate and insult 300 million people who consume basketball in China, who are interested in basketball, who want more interaction with the NBA. They love the NBA. They love NBA players. They follow it religiously. What does it mean for the NBA to be put in this position where you have one of your worst players in the NBA, one of your most mediocre players in the NBA, become the face of an anti-China campaign that has absolutely nothing to bring to the NBA, but certainly it really doesn't bring anything to anybody except for the military-industrial complex and except for this very narrow set of interests, right? So when you think about Enes Kanter's allies crying persecution here, you got to think about, well, where else would it be okay? Especially for a real worker, right? Forget about the NBA players, even him making millions literally for being poor at his job. But think about workers. Are workers able to become the face of a imperialist propaganda campaign and get away with that? Maybe it would be useful. But I think what's important here is that Enes Kanter really made the bed he's laying in. He wanted to take advantage of this moment, this new Cold War moment, and make a political career for himself. That seems farther and farther down the road. Doesn't seem like what he did really landed with anyone outside of the far right and his friends and buddies in the ruling class who were using him for those ends. Doesn't seem like it really landed. No one really took him seriously. LeBron James didn't even look him in the face when they played each other. It was an incredible scene. He isn't big business for the NBA. And honestly, he isn't big business for the establishment. He's just a pawn. And now he's being played like one. And this is honestly the perfect case of you reap what you sow here. And so he's not going to speak at CPAC, and no one is going to miss it. No one's going to cry about it, right? It's a quote Eileen Gu, you know? No one's going to cry about this because Enes Kanter was a poor defender. And as John Smith says here, you're right. The Celtics are red hot, and part of it is their defense is incredible now. And ever since they stopped playing Enes Kanter, their defense has gotten much better. Not to say that he's the only factor there, but it is one of those factors if we're just talking purely basketball, purely personnel. So that's where we're at with Enes Kanter. Honestly, I'm glad he's not in the NBA. I know that he isn't going to stop his anti-China crusade, however, because there's always going to be opportunities. Beijing 2022 is happening, and we're going to get into that in a minute. But Enes Kanter, right? He represents, really, he personifies everything that this anti-China crusade is all about. The propaganda, number one, right? That China is a genocidaire, that it is committing genocide in Xinjiang, that it is repressing Hong Kong, that it is still, this talking point came up for Enes Kanter, that Tibet is under some horrific regime of oppression. All of these things have been deconstructed and debunked. I've done it here, talking about the feudal conditions of people in Tibet prior to the Chinese Revolution, talking about how Xinjiang's conditions of life have improved from life expectancy to just overall population to poverty alleviation, right? We can go on and on and on. Hong Kong, another situation where I interviewed David West and I showed through our joint analysis that Hong Kong actually was a colony of the British Empire, and it was given back to China in 1997, rightfully so, after decades and decades of negotiations and struggles. And essentially, that is what the imperialists wanted to go back to. And so they sponsored these protests through these organizations, through the NED, that wreaked havoc for a good several months to a year, but also in other periods, like in the 2014 umbrella movement, like in 2003, right? All these moments where the NED funded organizations wreaked havoc in Hong Kong to try to separate it or build up the conditions to separate it from China. That has failed, and China came in with its national security law and really honestly cleaned things up, but not in the way that people think. Not, oh, they didn't come in and literally sweep things up, literally, uh, repress people in Hong Kong. Actually, what they did was they finally enforced a key part of the basic law. And the basic law, which said that territorial integrity and sovereignty of China is principle, and that Hong Kong does need a national security law in order to enforce that. And it was never done until now, 2019. So now it's being done, and there's more peace in Hong Kong. And a lot of these folks like Joshua Wong and Jimmy Lai, these puppets of the West, they have been arrested, not in a lot of ways, not because of the protests, but because of other crimes that they've committed in the past. And it's basically over. And so all of this human rights propaganda is part of it. And it doesn't even have to be true. It just has to smear China. And then you go into the geopolitical part of which is related to the propaganda, in that by continuing to bash China, Enes Kanter was trying to profit from this. It's really fueling the military industrial complex. It's really fueling the big business interests that want to see China contained. It helps shape public opinion, so people think that China is their enemy. And that's what's happened. All right. The human rights atrocity propaganda is probably one of the hugest elements of shaping public opinion and getting people to think that China is their enemy. And now we have majorities of people in the United States, somewhere between 2/3 and 4/5 of people in the United States. And the same goes for Europe, that believe China is not only their biggest enemy, but also deserving of real punishment, right? You had lots of people polling in favor of an invasion of Taiwan, which just goes to show how much and how effective this warmongering is. So that's what Enes Kanter was all about. But we don't need to stay on him for too long, because it seems like his day in the sun has set, and he will have to figure out this MBA stuff, which he probably should have been doing all along. But it's attractive. It really is attractive to go after China because there's a lot of money pouring in. I analyzed in a prior article that the money that was being thrown around in legislation, like the Innovation and Competition Act, now the Competes Act, is hundreds of millions of dollars that would be going to the anti-China propaganda apparatus, like the U.S. Agency for Global Media. I surmise that someone like Enes Kanter was looking for that money. It's a lot easier to do that than play basketball. Basketball is actually pretty grueling for the body. It's a lot of labor. It's a lot of labor time. 82 game season, big chunk of the year where it's not a typical schedule. It's not like you're going 9 to 5. No, you're traveling, you're on. It's hard work. So for someone like Enes Kanter, who doesn't have many prospects within the game anymore, makes a lot of sense that, given his background with Fethullah Gulen and the reactionary Gulenist movement in Turkey, given his connections there, it makes sense, right, that anti-Palestinian far-right reactionary ideology led by Fethullah Gulen, a former CIA asset. Well, I think he's current CIA asset, but he's an asset nonetheless of the war machine. Given all of that, it makes sense that he would be so enthusiastic to jump on this bandwagon. So as you're coming in, please like the stream. Please do subscribe to the channel. And I am approaching 400 subscribers on Patreon. Please do subscribe if you can. I am setting this goal for the month of November. This is how you know I'm all over the place today. I was really thrown off by that audio issue. But this is basically my goal for the month of February, and it will go a long way to help keep me sustainable. But I got a long way to go, and I'm putting in the work. So appreciate all my supporters nonetheless. But that's Enes Kanter. So let's move on, because I want to talk about, while we have time, I want to talk about Dave Zirin. So my latest article on Dave Zirin, right, it covers a co-authored article he wrote about the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics. So Dave Zirin is someone I respect. I've read his articles both in The Nation and elsewhere. I have followed his coverage of the NBA strike during the bubble a couple of summers ago. I've been following his work on race in sports, on class in sports, and I am aware of his former ISO, because ISO is no longer operable, but I am aware of his connections. But nonetheless, he did good work in certain areas, so I do have respect for him. And surely that means, given his impact, given that he is known as basically the premier sports writer on the left, given that, I thought it was important to address his piece that he co-wrote with Jules. I keep on calling him Boykins, but it's Jules Boykoff. Sorry, I actually had to fix the whole article because I don't know why I thought it was Boykins, but Jules Boykoff. I'm not as well read on Boykoff. I've read some of his stuff on the Olympics, and he's generally like a predictable analyst in terms of the criticism of the Olympics is rooted in capitalism and their impact, and that's important, but it's pretty narrow nonetheless. And so I'm not surprised that I'm going to pull up the article. I'm not surprised that they would go down this anti-China rabbit hole, which a lot of the left has done. And I call that rabbit hole the American left's China exception, because what this really is all about is creating an exception for China when it comes to progressive values. Leftists in the United States have such a deep prejudice, mainly because they are seeped in the propaganda of the imperialists, and there's a long history of direct intervention in the movement by the CIA, by the FBI, to try to steer certain left organizations into a more acceptable political direction, namely to side against the peoples of the world, to side against the anti-imperialist forces of the world, the socialist forces of the world, beginning with the Cold War in the Soviet Union, creating all of these splits, all of these divides. And you see it still in the movement with so many different tendencies, all arguing about these particular questions, which date back to a very harrowing period. And that's where all of this comes from, right? All of this comes from the fact that Dave Zirin comes out of this tradition. He was a member of the ISO when it was around, and his politics are deeply shaped by it. And Jules Boykoff, he's written for Jacobin, he's written for some other liberal left publications, and so they share a political connection in that way. And they've written a lot of articles together, including on Peng Shuai, which I'm not even going to share, even though I mentioned in this article that this isn't the first time that they've had negative China coverage. I'm not going to share it because it's like you could just search, Google search Peng Shuai, and whatever article you come up with, New York Times, CNN, it doesn't matter, any of these Western press outlets, it sounds exactly the same. So I didn't even engage with them because I felt John Smith is saying he'll give me $30 for this shirt, and I will show you this shirt more later. And I could actually send the link if to where to get it from. I'd have to get it from my wife first, though, because she got it for me for this Christmas. But back to the article. I didn't engage with Zirin's Peng Shuai's analysis and Boykoff's analysis of it because it just wasn't worth it. It was all I had to say was it was regurgitating the corporate media here. And so in the article, I describe what the China exception is. As I said, it's those who commit to it, they repeat subtle yet dangerous aspects of the US's new Cold War propaganda while claiming to be opposed to a quote unquote hot war with China. And the conclusion is always that China is bad and doesn't deserve solidarity from the American left, even in the form of concrete opposition to US aggression. And this isn't spoken. Again, the China exception is not necessarily spoken. It's not China's bad and we agree with Pompeo. No, it's not like that. It's really omission. It's really a decision to not focus at all on what US imperialism is doing in the Asia Pacific, the hundreds of military bases, the sanctions, the soft power subversion of all of the countries in that region, so to speak, that aren't aligned with the United States, but especially China, the meddling in Xinjiang, in Hong Kong, all of that. None of it is mentioned, right? At least from the perspective of an anti imperialist, right? It's not talked about. It's just regurgitated subtleties about human rights and why we need to be in solidarity with oppressed people in China and all of these abstractions. And so this tendency to commit this China exception is so evident in Zirin and Boykoff's work. And I talk about it with their articles on Peng Shuai, which was just like an Associated Press report that they wrote twice, once in November and then I think once in October, once in November, as kind of like a follow up of where is she. all of this nonsense. And for those who aren't familiar, Peng Shuai is the famous tennis player who here I posted the picture of her defeating Venus Williams in 2016. An incredible tennis player, was said to have disappeared after posting on, I think it was Weibo, a whole thing about her relationship with a former vice premier in China, Zhang Guoli, and she ended up taking it down, or the Chinese censors, right? The Chinese state, or the app itself. We can't just assume it was the state. The app itself may have taken it down because of the sensitivities around it. And then it created this whole media stir. But really, the media stir was going to happen anyway, which is part of the reason why there is this great firewall in China, is because there's a geopolitical situation that is being regulated both on the business end and in the end of politics. So the truth really was Peng Shuai was fine. She was not disappeared. She was posting on social media over that whole period in October, November, where everyone was saying she was missing, and the tennis association, the World Tennis Association, politicizing it. The whole entire political spectrum on the ruling of the ruling class across the political spectrum was politicizing it. But she was fine, and it's unclear what happened in the relationship. There was a translation that went around, and I speculated that it's unclear whether there's sexual abuse going on, and we can't just assume that. But nonetheless, it was assumed. It seemed like it wasn't a great situation, and she was very broken up about it. But in conclusion, it was just another talking point to forward this new Cold War on China through the atrocity propaganda campaign. And it was about building up to this moment of the Beijing 2022 Olympics, where the propaganda has only gotten more ridiculous. And we'll get into that. So I talk about how I went after David Clion, and you should read that article in Substack, where he basically attacks the left, attacks Chow Collective, Vijay Prashad, elevates people like Matt Duss, who literally in the article says he supports Magnitsky sanctions, a really brutal form of so-called targeted sanctions that are all about regime change. But this is who he elevates, people like him, people like Promise Lee of Laosang Collective, people who are very anti-China from the perspective of this kind of soft left. Well, we actually are against colonialism and against imperialism, but both Chinese and US imperialism, this kind of both sides ism, which I'm talking about here as well. So they go on to talk about Zirin and Boykov, the Winter Olympics. And in the article that they wrote, they talk about all these fair points, right? Eileen Gu being attacked by the right, by the media, the role of the mainstream media in fueling anti-Asian racism. They talk about sports washing being a hypocritical accusation against China, using sports as a way to wash over human rights crimes and political, economic exploitation, given how NBC is profiting massively off of Olympic coverage over the next 2 decades. So still, though, right, Zirin and Boykov commit the China exception mainly through this whole idea of campism, right? They say campism a lot. So either you're in one camp, which is anti-China, or you're in another, which is pro-China. And so Zirin and Boykov believe that the concern for some outside of these camps is not centered on anti-China sentiment, the criticism that people are leveling. So for some, right, that's not the case. They're not in this camp. And I think Zirin and Boykov are positioning themselves as being transcendent of these camps. But they don't specify that in this analysis. We're just supposed to believe that non-campus leftists exist and are concerned with building solidarity with oppressed groups in China. And I say that there's only one citation in the entire article in reference to this point, and it is of the Uyghur Tribunal that was covered by an Al Jazeera article. And the Uyghur Tribunal was this mock trial that was put on in the UK by a consortium of human rights organizations, all NED aligned or sponsored or funded, that concluded that China has committed genocide in Xinjiang province. But the sponsor of the Uyghur Tribunal is the World Uyghur Congress, which is a very familiar name for those who have been following this The World Uyghur Congress is financed by the National Endowment for Democracy. It's received millions of dollars if you go back, but I just cite 2020 here, where they received $400,000 during the pandemic alone to in 2020 to essentially spread this human rights atrocity propaganda. So statements from the Uyghur Tribunal, or taken at the Uyghur Tribunal, were very familiar as well for those who have been following this. So you had Adrian Zenz, the far right Christian fundamentalist and Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation so called scholar. You had Wang Lijian, who says he was a former police officer in Xinjiang, Uyghur Autonomous Region, who changed his name shortly after this June testimony of last year. He changes his name for a CNN interview to spread this misinformation just under a different name. It was actually quite incredible to see how he took the stories from the Uyghur Tribunal and CNN interview with different names, essentially to try to almost pile on the legitimacy that these narratives were supposed to have. But it's so incredibly foolish and such an operation, right? How much of an operation is it to peddle someone like this Wang Lijian, who still is wearing his police uniform, supposedly? So I guess he left China, right? He fled China, this repressive authoritarian dictatorship. He fled China to give this testimony in London and then to be interviewed by CNN, ostensibly outside of London. So he's moving around and he's just carrying around this uniform and somehow is able to smuggle that out despite the horrible repression that happens in China. It's just a ridiculous, ridiculous scene. But nonetheless, I digress. To continue. So that's the only citation that Zirin and Boykov provide. But none of the inconsistencies with that coverage is included. So nonetheless, it's just taken as fact. And they move on to praise Mike Tirico. I don't know if you all watched the opening ceremony, but I did. And I was abhorred. I was disgusted by it. It was truly just that's disgusting. It had no substance to it. It was as if I was just watching the corporate media headlines be regurgitated over and over and over again by Tirico, and there was a few others, a Bloomberg journalist, quote unquote, and also a Yale academic who's a linguist but considers herself a China expert, and they were just going on and on and on. But Zirin and Boykov praised Mike Tirico, saying he spoke inconvenient truths and that they addressed the human rights elephant in the room. But because of how anti-China sentiment is so widespread right now, it wasn't a brave thing to do. That's the conclusion. I don't even know what kind of analysis this is supposed to be. Honestly, it was very amateurish for someone of the level of work and analysis that Dave Zirin generally gives on issues outside of China. Again, it's a China exception. And people's journalistic and analytical skills kind of go out the window when they are jumping on the anti-China bandwagon. And so the number one job of a journalist is to not repeat mainstream narratives, but thoroughly investigate the truth behind them, if there's any. And so I don't think it's campism to acknowledge that claims of genocide in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region are dubious at best and outright lies at worst. The problems with these claims go far beyond the biased sources, too. It's not just that the World Uyghur Congress is linked to the national security state of the United States. No, it's the fact that whatever you think of China's policy in Xinjiang, if you don't agree with it, if you don't think education and employment and some level of criminal justice involvement is correct for what's going on in Xinjiang, that's your prerogative. And you should make an argument based on what you think. But you can't call it genocide. because the Uyghur population has increased more than 25% since 2010, from 2010 to 2018. Life expectancy has more than doubled since 1949. It was 30 in 1948, and now it is over 72. I believe it's 70, more like 74 now. And then also, many of the social indicators for Uyghurs are similar to the general population in China, the mainland. Xinjiang is part of mainland China, but if we're going to break them up, life expectancy, poverty, these things are similar. Not the same, because there was more underdevelopment in Xinjiang than in other parts. Let's say southern China, Guangzhou, for example, was much better off for a long time, but Xinjiang is catching up. And so there isn't that much of a disparity. So, you compare this to something like occupied Afghanistan, right? The differences between US livelihoods and the livelihoods of people in Afghanistan, Israel Palestine, right? The livelihoods of settlers in Israel versus the colonized and occupied Palestinians. You'll see huge differences. But for the Uyghurs in Xinjiang compared to the rest of China, it's just not the case. But no, it was Tarico that spoke inconvenient truths instead of Zirin and Boykov. They decided to avoid all of these inconvenient truths. But for them, Tarico saying that there's human rights violations is good enough. And so it's a byproduct, right, of this China exception mentality. People who commit to this, they dismiss or omit the political agenda behind US claims of human rights abuses in China. This is another element. It's not difficult to discern because the US has made so many policy maneuvers based on these dubious claims of Chinese wrongdoing. This includes economic sanctions on China's solar industry and the newly passed Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act at the end of last year, which is a virtual blockade on all imports from the region. So think about that. That's the impact of this. That's a significant impact. And it's completely omitted all the time. Always it's omitted from the analysis of these American leftists who think China is the exception to their rule of progressivism. So these policies hurt ordinary Uyghurs, the very people Zirin and Zirin and Boykov claim to support. They also fuel the anti-China racism that Zirin and Boykov claim to oppose because, well, if you continuously demonize China, then China is there's no disconnecting China and the Chinese people, although all these Americans and Westerners love to say it's not China, it's the Chinese people that we love. We don't like their government. You can't separate the two in this case because the political agenda equates the two, right? Chinese people are seen as either automatons of their government with no agency of their own, or super exploited and oppressed by their government, or basically brainwashed into supporting, right? There's no disconnection. So, and also there is no disconnection in the real sense because the majority of people in China, and we'll get into this, approve of their government. So this mentality also worsens relations between the US and China, these policies that further exacerbate the campism. This is what is interesting. They say campism is an unfortunate barrier to a better politics. Well, by completely omitting all sides of this issue and just regurgitating the US establishment, you're in fact choosing a camp. And by regurgitating and reinforcing the propaganda that justifies these policies. So for me, the term campism is a euphemism for the slogan neither Washington nor Beijing, which is a widely accepted slogan on the American left and a critical feature of this China exception mentality. Zirin and Boycott assert that the conditions of Chinese workers and women and ethnic minorities is reason enough to stand against China's government. They forget, as many leftists in the United States do, that the conditions of the Chinese people are for the Chinese people to resolve. The concept of self-determination is rejected entirely, which helps explain why neither Zirin, Boykov, nor the nation has yet to take a firm stance against the U.S. imperialist aggression occurring toward China. So we're almost done here, but I just want to go over some of the last points I made. we're left with more questions than answers by Zirin, right? And these are some I asked. Is it campism to give attention to the fact that Western studies have found China's government to possess a public satisfaction rating above 90%? Is it campism to acknowledge China's successful poverty alleviation program and COVID 19 response? Is it campism to conclude that China's geopolitical influence is defined by cooperation and solidarity? I mean, after all, China's export of COVID 19 vaccines and infrastructure development are wildly different, in contrast wildly from the US's trademark of bombs and sanctions. So this slogan, either Washington or Beijing, is just a clear expression of the new Cold War led by the United States. The slogan doesn't apply to any other context, and this is another point I make. Zirin and company would never make a false equivalency between the Palestinian resistance and the Israeli settler state. Never would do that. Or the United States and Afghanistan, for that matter, as I said below. The answer is always no. They would never do this. The China exception in its neither Washington nor Beijing slogan assumed that China's growing economic and political influence makes it an equally villainous player on the world stage. Solidarity, then, is only warranted when those on the receiving end are weak and in no position to threaten U.S. hegemony. This is a point I make a lot. In order to receive solidarity from the American left, you got to be weak. You can't be independent. You can't be sovereign. You can't be charting a trajectory that is good for your people. Palestinians, which I fully support their self-determination, what would be the case if they had actually been powerful enough and in the position to have their own nation? I'm sure you would have a lot of demonization going on about how they chose to do things. And this goes for Nicaragua, Syria, we can go down the line, Eritrea. It's the similar mentality, but with China, it's even worse because unlike Nicaragua, unlike Eritrea, China is actually challenging U.S. hegemony in a much more powerful way, given its size, given its economic scope, given its impact on the world stage. China holds a bit of an enhanced position, right? The top enemy, so to speak. So, in conclusion, the best way for progressives and leftists to express solidarity with the Chinese people is by respecting their sovereignty. This requires shifting political analysis away from sensationalist and dubious human rights claims to the verifiable imperialist aggression waged by the United States against China in the Asia Pacific. Maybe Zirin and Boykov will listen to this. Maybe they'll read this article and they'll heed the call and reverse course. However, I'm not too confident given their recent work, and it's thus imperative for us to conclude this reading that I wanted to do during this live stream, that we confront the China exception tendency by placing the requisite pressure on the American left to stand on the right side of history. So you can catch this article in Substack in the description. So that's free. I put everything, no paywall on Substack. Patreon, a lot of the posts are public, but I try to keep them within the subscriber realm, and I have some other messages. But it concludes my analysis on Zirin. Dave Zirin is a very respected figure. He certainly has done a lot of good work. But again, it's really important to point this out during this Olympics period, given when this anti-China propaganda is really at its highest intensity, that the tendency for someone like Dave Zirin to do this is reflective of something a lot larger. It's reflective of the fact that a lot of the American left has been taken and has been convinced that China is this oppressive society that does not deserve our support against U.S. aggression. And that only leads to very bad things. It only leads to worse and worse policy by the United States' empire, and it leads to a complete shift in priorities where they need to be. We only reinforce anti-Asian racism and this geopolitical nightmare that we're in if we do not reverse course and really stand opposed to this new Cold War, and also in solidarity with actual Chinese people, the 90+% who support their government, those who are happy with their quality of life improving, with poverty alleviation, with the way that they've handled COVID-19. And so this Olympics coverage, it was pathetic because there's so many things that could have been covered. And I'm going to cover some of this other ridiculous coverage because I have some things I want to play for you guys in terms of a few athletes who I think I'm going to write about, Tessa Maud and the snowboarder Aaron Blanc. They by themselves have debunked this ridiculous Olympic coverage, right? And I'm going to play some of what they said because I think it's important to see. However, that Zirin and Boykov could not engage in any of the things that have gone very well at the Beijing 22 Winter Olympics, I think just shows the bias. And let me just list off some of those things that I am aware of. First, the closed loop, the COVID-19 closed loop. China has done an incredible job containing COVID-19, really is the hallmark of the world's response, really is the example that every country probably should have emulated, and some countries did, and most countries did not. And the United States had a huge role in that. But nonetheless, China has been able to stop the worst effects of COVID-19 from ravaging their society. And not only have has China only experienced, I think, one death since 2021, since the beginning of 2021 from COVID-19, but also life is relatively back to normal. All of this got to get back to normal, got to get back to normal mentality that a lot of people have, even on the left, with response to COVID-19. China has kind of done that with these mitigation measures, and the closed loop is a big part of that. And it's been praised, and you'll see that. But also with the clean energy, right? 100% clean energy Olympics. All of the facilities were powered by green energy, electricity, wind, and solar. And 80% of the facilities themselves were repurposed from 2008. I mean, that's an incredible feat in and of itself, something that's never been done before, and just shows how far China is willing to go to make good on their commitments to reducing the impact of climate change as China still tries to develop out of their status historically as being one of the poorest countries in the world. Still, despite China's huge economy that will likely surpass the US in GDP terms by the end of the decade, China is still a relatively poor country with a per capita GDP about a fifth to a sixth of the United States. And some places don't have basic amenities. Even though extreme poverty has been eliminated, there's still the quality, there's still the value in certain areas that needs to be enhanced in order to increase people's quality of life. And China is committed to reducing climate change while balancing their economic development. It's one of the few countries in the world that's doing that. And so salute to China for applying that to the Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics. So also during the Olympics, Beijing debuted a high-speed rail just for the games, right? Well, not just for the games, but high-speed rail that was debuted for the games to make it easier to travel to and from the two locations where these games would be occurring. And to me, that's just an incredible testament to the investment that China has made in infrastructure, high quality public infrastructure, which increases people's quality of life and also increases economic development, improves the overall situation for society, and also helps fight climate change by transitioning from this kind of high carbon intensive industrial model to a more high tech model that uses clean energy. This particular high speed rail was actually the first self driving model as well. So think about that. For the Beijing 22 Winter Olympic Games, in a world filled with chaos, catastrophe from COVID-19, the economic situation not being great, China was able to do this, literally roll out an invention, a self driving high-speed rail just for the games. So why hasn't anyone talked about that? It's pretty ridiculous. here in the West to think about, that none of this is mentioned. You can't say good things about China. And actually, Olympic athletes have experienced how you get backlash for saying good things about China. I mean, first we had Eileen Gu, who's still fighting the good fight out there, going after Western media whenever they attack China on social media. But more broadly, Eileen Gu was attacked just for choosing China as the team she wanted to represent, the country she wanted to represent, because she hails from China. Her mom is Chinese, hails from China, has Chinese citizenship. And Eileen Gu has a pretty strong moral compass to try to use her status as a way to fight this Cold War mentality. She doesn't say it like that, but to say you want to enhance cooperation between countries and people is in direct contradiction to this new Cold War. But it wasn't just Eileen Gu who has received some backlash. So this is a story that came out. I think it wasn't today, but it was in the last few days. So Winter Olympics U.S. skier says Twitter account suspended after he praised Beijing Games. They get pretty bad media, he said. The three-time Olympian Aaron Blunk says China has done a stellar job while criticizing biased coverage of the games. Snowboarder Tessa Maud, who I was also going to talk about, says she has tears in her eyes when she recalls how warmly she was welcomed on arrival in Beijing. So the story is three-time Olympian Aaron Blunk said he was suspended from Twitter after he and his U.S. ski teammates praised China for its stellar operations at the Olympic Village. Quote, well, let me show you what he actually said. But, quote, they have honestly done a stellar job with the whole COVID protocol. So there you go. The 25-year-old told reporters in the press room before criticizing biased coverage of the games. I didn't know what to expect. Being stateside, you've kind of got some pretty bad media, and that is completely false. It's actually been phenomenal, he said. So he said that his Twitter account was then suspended after saying this, and then went to Instagram to protest the social platform's unexplained decision, reposting a fan's comment that read, Aaron Blunk is out here telling the truth and getting punished by his own government. So Blunks further shared a commentator's tweet accusing the U.S. government of being behind his account being shut down. Twitter has executed the order of the Western ruling cabals. Punishment comes pretty fast, Blunk tagged Twitter and asked, what I do? So here you go. This is the whole scene here for Aaron Blunk. And, I'm just going to stop it there because I want to show you what he actually said. So I'm going to actually share the video. Bear with me here. So we're going to get Aaron Blunk's direct take.
Accommodation.
Hold on one second. So this is Jing Lee's video. Just let me know. So Jing Lee, good comrade. I'm not sure if I shared the audio here. I think I did. But let me know if you can hear this, okay? I want to actually fast forward to what he said. Actually, we can just watch the whole video because I think this gets
of the Beijing 2022 Winter.
This gets to the heart of the matter. So let's just play this whole video because it's actually a really good video. I highly recommend you follow Jing Lee, good friend of mine as well. So here we go.
Olympics, you probably will believe, wow, this Winter Olympics suck. Some American journalists in the closed loop are complaining their steak is too dry. Some complaints, why my martini is served by a bartender in hazmat suit. What a dystopian world am I living in? But if you hear from actual athletes who are competing at this Winter Olympics, and some of them participated in several Olympics, not just Beijing 2022, you will hear completely different stories.
Being stateside, you kind of heard some pretty bad media, and that is completely false. It's actually been phenomenal. Everybody from staff to COVID testers to accommodation, it's probably honestly one of the better Olympics that we've been to. So
I just think all the people in the staff within the Olympic Village are so genuine and kind, and they're such a happy, they're always waving their hands, so excited, and it's just refreshing and it's nice to see.
in that moment, that was the craziest moment of my life. Genuinely, like the craziest moment.
Welcome to China! Thank you!
So, and that guy who had said, "Welcome to China," literally just like makes me tear up every time because they're so nice. Like all the volunteers are so sweet and so kind, and they're just like so happy that we're here. We feel so welcome.
So, why athletes and media are presenting completely different stories of the same Olympics? What are the other stories that the media is not showing you? Let's take a look together. Hey guys, welcome to Talk It Out. I'm Li Jingjing. More latest stories about the Winter Olympics. In last episode, we take a look at how some Western media are attacking freestyle skier Eileen Gu, who was born in the United States, but chose to represent China during this Beijing 2022 Olympics. And they are continuing doing it. Take a look at this article by The Economist. I don't know, how do you feel about this headline and the image, but to me, it's a little bit racist. And you can sense some Western.
A little bit racist, yeah, just a little bit. I mean, I remember citing that article. I didn't even look at the image. Sometimes I don't look at these images because they're just so far flung, right? They're just so over the top that now I'm almost inclined not to look at them because I'm just like, damn, this is intense, right? So anyway, in that article, Jingjing Li won't get into it deeply, but in that Economist article, they try to make it, and you can kind of see in the headline, they try to make it that Eileen Gu had some agonizing experience choosing China, right? That she was caught in between these superpowers and she didn't know what to do. Literally no quotes. They didn't even, you'll see, they didn't talk to her at all. And they just made this up to paint this story. Anyway, let's go.
Fragility. How dare this half Chinese woman chose to represent China? But Eileen Gu is fighting back. It's not the first time Eileen Gu fires back at the Western media's unbalanced report. When figure skater Zhu Yi, who gave up her American citizenship and joined the Chinese citizenship, she was bullied by a small group of ignorant users online. But that's just a small group of ignorant trolls. They do not represent the public opinion of Chinese. The majority of Chinese actually really understand what she went through, and they really understand athletes may fail and totally understand and support her.
And actually, Zhu Yi recovered. Yesterday, she was back on the ice to compete with her sweetest smile and huge cheering from Chinese audiences and her teammates.
宝贝晚安，宝贝早点睡，我还要去下一场排队。
But the insider wrote this story. But guess who fights back? Eileen Gu again. She says, as someone who actually uses Chinese social platforms, I'm going to say right here that over 90% of comments are positive and uplifting. It's part of the sport and everyone understands that. It's harder for these Western journalists to make Winter Olympics look bad because actually athletes from around the world have been sharing how much they enjoy the food, the facilities, accommodation, the hospitality of Chinese people during this Beijing 2022. They are sharing that on their personal social platforms.
This is my red bean bug. Red bean bug, right? It's so yummy. Green tea cookie. Like matcha shortbread. Let's try grape. They have little stems. I've never had this. Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my god, it's so good.
I have something incredible to share. Because not only do we not have cardboard beds here, but it's as if the Beijing organizing committee said, how can we just absolutely just one up Tokyo? And this is what they went with. I'm in 0G mode now. It's phenomenal.
there is different gifts. Some of them are not just from the host country, but the people of the host country. I was a bit touched by the fact that a Chinese kid has like handmade, each of them are individual for every athlete here. They handmade a drawing. They really did a great effort. And then we got that as we arrived here, like as a gesture, as a way of supporting us as athletes.
Seems like all the athletes are having a pretty good time, and the US journalists are the only ones complaining. And maybe that's why these warmongering media and politicians who constantly pushing anti-China narratives were afraid of people coming to China for Winter Olympics. Because once people come here, they like here. They see the truth, they see the hospitality of Chinese people with their own eyes. And the media's lies about China just fall apart.
So there you go. I mean, I get emotional when I see that stuff just because I miss it so bad. When I see Tessa Ma eating all that food, I'm just like, girl, you're really killing me right now, because the food in China is incredible. You can get so many different things. One of the interesting things about opening up and reform that is really, I think, for me, I mean, for anybody, just such a interesting thing to see is just, opening up a reform is often seen as like, oh, foreign capital just came in and ran roughshod over the Chinese economy, and now it's just like foreign direct investment is dominating the country. Well, when you go to China, even in the busiest, most metropolitan areas of Beijing, the number of these small private businesses that obviously have government support, with government owns the land, first of all, so regulates the cost of the property, the leasing of the property. But man, when you see how many different kinds of things you can get, and just, it's overwhelming to some degree, but like I had no idea, but everything is good. And yeah, it's certainly an experience. And so Tessa Ma, man, when I'm watching her TikTok, I actually have her TikTok up, and I can share some of the stuff that she shared, because it is quite incredible what Tessa did, especially because I think all she did was show how good the food was, in her opinion, how tasty it was, and how much she appreciated being treated so kindly. I mean, it's just at that human level, such small gestures being significant of something, I think also shows that Tessa is not the typical arrogant American. I mean, Jesus, some of the people I went to China with had a completely different way of relating, and they're not fucking Olympic snowboarders and skiers and winter athletes with all this talent. No, but obviously she comes from a more humble place. But let's look at her TikTok, all right? And I want to play some of them because I think it's just beautiful to see, right? Beautiful to see. And I want to first show the one where she talks about how appreciative, craziest night of my life. Let's watch this one.
We're in the bus.
There's a high-speed rail right there.
Wow.
There's the bird's nest.
Bulgaria. Welcome to China. Thank you. Welcome. Oh
We're on our way. We're in the bus.
All right, so that was just a quick TikTok from her. You know how much. So here's the scene that.
Welcome to China. Thank you. Welcome.
So she said, "Bring me to tears every time." I mean, it's just. I think there's something very significant. That's why I definitely want, and why I do raise money for my work, is because I definitely want to go back and show people that there is a different way of relating in China, that Chinese people do not look at foreigners. There definitely is a nationalism there, and there definitely is some suspicion of foreigners, but there is also a pretty broad understanding of how important it is to have cordial relations with everybody, and there is a different cultural and social relationship that people had, the way that you're treated there, even by security. It's just different. Like, they're not there to like bat you over the head, like, even in airport security or the transit security. It never felt like, I remember they were looking at my bags through one of these like whatever checkpoints through the tourist areas, and they were just like, "Do you have a knife?" Like, they couldn't say it in English, but they knew I couldn't understand Mandarin, and I was like, "No," because they spotted some metal, and then I took out like a water bottle, and they're just like, "Oh, fine," and it was just a different way of being that was so beautiful, and I miss it so much. So when I look at these athletes getting to go, I'm just like, you are lucky. Jing Lee, she had a opening ceremony video that got taken down because of copyright, but I watched it before it got taken down, and I was just thinking in my head, oh my gosh, take me back. Like, I wish I was there. So let's just do a little bit of her food. So here's the bad food in China. So that's just some of the bad food in China, right? Oh, it looks gross. Here's another.
I'm at the restaurant. I just ordered, so I'll show you what I got. This is what I got so far. These are like free snacks. This is so good. I love these. Here's my stir-fried broccoli and kung pao chicken. It looks so good. It's literally so good. I feel like I've been eating vegetables the whole time I've been here, so really good. I love the onions and the peanuts and the chilies. Literally amazing.
I miss those. I really miss those. So anyway, that gives you just a little bit of a taste of, first of all, the food. But it was because you had, as you saw Jing Lee post, oh, these Western journalists, US journalists, they can't eat the good Western food that they want. They can't get their steak and fries that they want. Meanwhile, you have all this incredible food at your disposal. And Ian Goodrum tweeted, I hope to have Ian Goodrum on here someday because he is also a good comrade. But he tweeted that they're obviously ordering, he lives in Beijing, they're obviously ordering Western food on purpose, because even if you go to like a McDonald's and KFC in Beijing, it's different. It's not 100% exported American food. There's a lot of Chinese characteristics put into it. And so you're not going to get like a traditional American cheeseburger from McDonald's in China. And you know what? That's 100% okay. I am okay with that. I'm actually more than okay with that. When I look at what Tessa Mod was eating, I literally just break up inside because the shit that I'm forced to eat in the United States, the nastiness. I mean, when I was in China, although I had a lot of stomach troubles because of the jet lag, holy crap. Never experienced that in my life. I felt crazy. I felt like I was going insane because I had stomach issues for like 7 days out of the 15, 16 that I was there. So, and what Tessamad said, you can go a long time without eating vegetables because there's so much incredible meat, so much incredible dumplings. So you can go a long time without eating, even though there are vegetables served, but you can go a long time without it if you decide to choose what you find to be the most tasty. So yeah, when I just think about the contrast, I'm just like, take me back. But anyway, it's just a simple way of debunking that horrific anti-China propaganda. And it's not going to stop because the agenda is still there. And it's up to us to really attack this, to really counter it. Because people like Dave Zirin, people like Jules Boykoff, people on the most of the American left, most of the Western left, they're not going to do it because they are invested in the anti-China propaganda and the new Cold War in their own way. Even if they say they're not for a hot war, they're for war. And no matter what form the war takes, it usually always leads in the same direction to more conflict, more imperialism, more suffering for people, especially the indigenous people of the Asia Pacific, especially for those smaller, lesser developed countries still under the gun of imperialism. That's who really suffers the most under this, because China will be okay. As long as there's not some kind of nuclear winter, China will be okay. China will continue to do what it is set out to do, develop its economy, alleviate relative poverty now, become a modern socialist country by 2050. It will continue to do the Belt and Road Initiative, to build that up, to build a multipolar world, to increase unity in the country, to create a common future for humankind, a shared future for humankind. That's what China's going to do. And no amount of propaganda is going to stop that. The problem is that it stops us. It stops us. It makes it so our priorities here in the belly of the imperialist beast are so warped that we end up being pawns and agents in the imperialist design. And it's happening to more and more people now. And it's getting more and more subtle now with this whole COVID-19 lockdown left narrative, with this complete refutation of public health and mitigation measures, with this growing right-wing sentiment, libertarian sentiment, as a response to neoliberalism. I mean, all of that is inevitably going to come back at China. I mean, I remember during the second iteration of the lab leak theory, and everyone was getting on Fauci, which, look, I'm no Fauciite. I certainly don't like the guy. But to take it to this narrative, oh, there was a lab leak and the US was going behind China's back, even to assume that, is just to believe in politics as fable, right? It's not even legitimately believable. It's not even something worth investigating, because now you're talking about a sovereign country, a proud country, a country that is highly intentional about how it maintains its self-determination and how it stays on task with its national interests. Now you're talking about that country letting the United States meddle in its affairs to the point where the United States creates a virus behind its back. First of all, a virus that isn't even really, you can't, for what we know, you can't make SARS-CoV-2 in a lab. You just can't do it. It's just too hard. Sorry, human beings just ain't there yet. Not even the big bad CIA and the Pentagon, which they're capable of a lot of things, a lot of biological and chemical warfare, of which I covered in one of my latest Substack articles last month. But you can't do that. You can't create a whole new virus. You can certainly do other things. You can spread the plague, you can spread bacterial infections, you can spread that. That's been done by the US government. You can check out my article and see. On biological and chemical warfare by the United States. Look at what Agent Orange did to Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, U.S. veterans here, Vietnamese people, Laos, Hmong people here. There's so many people infected with Agent Orange. And that includes, I know I have a comrade, Panamanian, talks about how it was done in Panama. It's been done in a lot of places, guys. Agent Orange. So look, that's biological warfare, not out of the realm of the U.S.'s capacity. Creating a whole new virus? Yeah, that's out of the U.S. That's out of all of our capacity. And so to believe that there's some sort of smoking gun, it just drives me absolutely bonkers, because it just reinforces anti-China propaganda in the most, not stealth to me, but it is stealth in the broader sense, because ordinary people, if you make that argument, they might be convinced because they're so distrustful of the United States, rightfully so. And therefore, they will also start to have assumptions about China. China's stupid. China's weak. China is unable to counter and fight back against U.S. wrongdoing. it really does distort the international situation. So